The logging road into Harrow Creek smelled like wet spruce and last night's rain, and Declan Marsh had not yet killed the chainsaw when the convoy arrived. 3 black Escalades, each one spotless in a way that made no sense for a gravel road in northern British Columbia, pulled up to the tree line and stopped. A woman stepped out of the middle one. She had the kind of posture that announces itself before the person does. Straight spine, shoulders level, the particular stillness of someone who has never once waited for a parking spot. She looked at the felled spruce, then at the man holding the chainsaw, then at the felled spruce again. "Hey, is the owner around, or are you it?" Declan set the saw down on the hood of his truck. His daughter was in the cab, eating apple slices from a bag, watching through the windshield with the serious attention of a 7-year-old who has learned that interesting things happen when adults get quiet. "Depends what you need," he said. The woman, city boots, tailored coat, a phone already in one hand, let her eyes move across the property the way a surveyor does, not looking at anything, pricing it. "I need to talk to someone with authority over this parcel," she said. "If that's not you, point me to who it is." Declan picked up his work gloves and folded them together slow. "Ma'am, this parcel's been in my family since 1923. I'm pretty sure that's authority." She looked at the chainsaw, at the truck with the rusted quarter panel, at his boots. The look lasted exactly 2 seconds and said everything she did not say out loud. She placed a card on his truck hood, cream stock, silver letters, and walked back to the Escalade. The convoy reversed out the way it came. In the cab, his daughter Bryn reached for another apple slice. "Dad, why didn't she say thank you?" Declan looked at the card without picking it up. "Some people forget to." The card said Harlow Group, Acquisitions and Development, Vancouver. The name printed under the logo was Simone Harlow. He left it on the truck hood overnight, and it was still there in the morning, curled at the corner from the dew. In Harrow Creek, a town of 800 people at the end of a 2-lane highway in the Skeena country, the Harlow Group's arrival was not a secret by the time Declan walked into the Millstone Cafe for breakfast. Bede O'Callagh, who had owned the cafe for 31 years and knew every piece of news in the valley before it happened, set his coffee down without him asking. "They've been in to see the municipality," she said. "Proposed development, resort and spa. They want the lakefront." Declan wrapped both hands around the mug. "Which lake?" Bet looked at him. "Ah." Coldwater Lake sat at the edge of the Marsh property, 212 acres of old-growth timber, a stretch of shoreline that faced west and caught the afternoon light in a way that made even the people who'd lived beside it all their lives stop sometimes and look. His wife Lenore had written her graduate thesis on the watershed ecology of that lake. She'd mapped every inlet and wetland fringe by hand, spring and fall, for 4 years. The maps were still in the studio she'd used as an office in the blue cardboard binders she'd labeled in her careful block printing. Declan had not moved them. He drove home the long way, along the south side of the property where the lake showed itself between the spruce stands. The October light came across the water flat and gold. Bryn was at school. The property was quiet enough that he could hear the creak from the road. He pulled over and sat with the engine running for a while. Then he took out his phone and called his lawyer in Smithers. Simone Harlow had grown up in a glass condo tower in Cole Harbour, Vancouver, looking at water she was not allowed to touch. Her father had been the kind of man who treated real estate as warfare, not cruel but systematic, and not interested in anything that didn't compound. She had spent 15 years learning to be very good at a version of his business that she told herself was different because she had an ESG mandate and a sustainability page on the company website. She was 38. She had not taken a vacation in 4 years. She had closed 11 deals in the last 3. The Coldwater Lake development, a 46-unit resort with spa facilities, a private marina, and what the concept deck called an integrated wilderness experience, would be the largest project Harlow Group had ever attempted. It would also, if the bond financing came through, make her independently wealthy, in a way that would mean she never had to do this again if she didn't want to. She did not examine that thought too closely. The holdout parcel was the problem. The Marsh property controlled the southern shoreline and the creek drainage. Without it, the environmental assessment couldn't clear. Without the assessment, the financing wouldn't close. She had offered $2.4 million in the first approach. She had been told the property was not for sale. She had driven up from Prince George in the dark that morning. She'd stood in front of a man with a chainsaw and done what she always did when a deal was resistant. She'd looked at the asset, not the person holding it, and she'd retreated to recalibrate. What she had not done, not until that evening, was look up the property in the provincial land title database herself. The search came back. Marsh Family Holdings, Coldwater North, registered 19's active. Water license. Active, classified as senior priority. Commercial fishing tenure, heritage classification, non-transferable. Environmental covenant registered to the property under the Provincial Conservation Act. Intact riparian buffer, no subdivision, no development within 150 meters of the ordinary high water mark. She read through it twice. Then she opened the satellite imagery on her second monitor. The property wasn't 200 acres. It was 460. She had been looking at the wrong boundary line on the concept map. She sat back. Below the land title result, there was a secondary search flag. She clicked it. A heritage designation application, filed 18 months ago under Lenore Marsh, Ph.D., University of Northern British Columbia, for the Coldwater Creek watershed as a provincially significant ecological study site. The application was pending. If approved, it would place a conservation easement over the entire drainage, including the shoreline she needed. Simone stared at the screen. The woman in the file photo was maybe 35. Dark hair pulled back. She was standing in chest waders in a creek, holding a water sampling kit and looking at the camera like she hadn't known anyone was watching. Below the photo, a small biographical note. Lenore Marsh, née Calloway, died February 2022. Application submitted posthumously by estate. Simone closed the laptop. She did not open it again that night. The next morning, she did not call her Vancouver office. She drove instead to the Millstone Cafe, ordered coffee at the counter, and sat at a table by the window. She opened her laptop and pretended to work. Declan came in 20 minutes later. He had the girl with him. Small, serious face, a braid that had come partly undone, a backpack shaped like a fox. He sat her at the counter and ordered for both of them, without looking at a menu. Simone watched him cut a piece of French toast into small triangles and slide the plate toward the girl. She watched him listen to something the girl said, and answer without looking up, and she watched the girl put her chin in her hand and look satisfied. She had not noticed the day before that his face was tired in the particular way that has nothing to do with sleep. He looked up and saw her looking. She looked back at her screen. After a moment she heard the stool scrape, and then he was standing beside the table. He was not holding a card. He did not have a professional smile. He had a cup of coffee and a look that wasn't unfriendly exactly, but was something more like honest. "You're still in town," he said. "I am." He nodded at the chair across from her. She nodded at it. He sat down. He said, "You've been to the municipality." "I have." "And you found the covenant." She kept her face still. "And I found the covenant." He looked at her for a moment. "Then you know why we're talking in circles." She set her laptop lid down halfway. "Mr. Marsh, I'd like to understand what it would take, not to buy the land. I understand it's not for sale, but if there were a path to partnership, conservation integrated development, your water rights respected, heritage designation advanced rather than threatened." "Messrs. Harlow," he said, "the creek runs through my property before it reaches the lake. No infrastructure gets built on that shoreline without my signature. Not one nail." He said it quietly, without emphasis, the way a person states a fact they've known long enough that stating it feels almost unnecessary. She looked at him. "I know," she said. He stood up. He went back to the counter. The girl had finished her French toast and was drawing something on a paper napkin. He looked at the drawing and said something to her that made her laugh. Simone did not leave the cafe for another hour. She sat there with her cold coffee and thought about the word partnership, and what she actually meant by it and how different that was from what she'd said. 3 kilometers from town, behind the old equipment barn, Declan climbed a set of stairs to the loft where he'd built his office the winter after Lenore died. He'd needed somewhere to put himself that wasn't the bedroom they'd shared. He'd put up shelves, brought out her field maps, stacked the blue binders along the south wall, where the light came in right. He hadn't moved them, because he didn't know where else they belonged. He sat at his desk and opened the folder his lawyer had couriered that morning. The Harlow Group's development proposals was 62 pages. He read every page. By the time he reached page 41, he had set down his coffee. By page 47 he had gone very still. the stormwater diversion plan, a culverted channel that would redirect the seasonal flood footflow of Coldwater Creek away from the natural wetland buffer, which would protect the resort from foundations during spring freshet, but which would, within 5 to 10 years, deprive the lower riparian zone of the sediment and moisture that kept it functioning. Lenore's maps showed exactly what that zone was. She'd mapped the amphibian breeding habitat, the old-growth nurse trees, the sedge meadows that filtered the water before it reached the lake. She'd spent 4 springs in rubber boots and a wool hat she'd owned since university, counting things most people didn't know needed counting. The diversion wasn't in the public summary, it was on page 41 of the engineering appendix, in language precise enough to be legal and vague enough to be deniable. Declan folded the document closed. He sat with it in his hands for a while. Then he called his lawyer again. "Petra," he said, "I need the full corporate filing history for Harlow Group, every subsidiary. And I need to know who their silent partners are in the resort bond syndicate." Simone drove back out to the property that afternoon. She didn't call ahead. She brought nothing. She parked at the cattle gate and walked the rest of the way on foot, because she hadn't wanted the sound of the Escalade, and because she wasn't sure what she was there to say, and walking gave her time to not yet say it. Declan was splitting wood at the side of the house. He saw her coming up the gravel track and he didn't stop what he was doing, but he also didn't speed up. When she got close enough, he set the maul down. She said, "I read the heritage application." He waited. "Lenore's work," she said. "The watershed mapping. I read the summary document." Something changed in his face. It was not dramatic. It was more like the settling of a foundation, a slight recalibration downward, like weight redistributing. "She spent 4 years on it," he said. "I know." Simone put her hands in her coat pockets. "I also know that if the application goes through, it affects the shoreline I need. I'm not here to fight the application." She paused. "I'm here because I found something in our own engineering appendix that I don't think I was supposed to find." He looked at her. She said, "The stormwater diversion plan, page 41. He was quiet for a long moment, then he said, "Come inside." The kitchen was warm, a wood stove in the corner, a child's drawing held to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a fish. He poured her a glass of water without asking, from a clay pitcher that sat on the counter, and she drank it before she thought about whether she was thirsty. It was cold and faintly mineral and tasted clean in a way that Vancouver tap water did not. He spread the engineering appendix on the kitchen table, beside his own copy, which he'd already been through. They sat across from each other and went through page 41 together. He asked her 3 questions she had answers for and 1 question she didn't. Who approved the diversion spec? She looked at the signature block, a name she recognized. Her director of infrastructure, a man who had been with Harlow Group for 11 years, who had come from the firm that managed the bond syndicate, and who she had trusted because he had always been good at the technical pieces she found least interesting. She did not answer right away. "I'll find out," she said. The back door opened and Bryn came in from outside, mud on her boots, carrying a pine cone in each hand like they were important. She stopped when she saw the woman at the table. Simone looked at the girl. She didn't know what to do with her face. Bryn walked over and set one of the pine cones on the table between them, deliberately, like an offering. "This one has all its scales," she said. "Most don't." "Thank you," Simone said. She picked it up. She held it in both hands and turned it over. Declan watched from across the table and did not say anything. That night, Simone drove the 40 minutes to the Smithers Ramada and sat on the edge of the bed with her laptop open. She called her director of infrastructure. He answered on the second ring. She asked him about page 41. There was a pause of exactly the wrong length. He said, "Simone, the diversion is industry standard for this. Who wrote the spec?" Another pause. "The bond syndicate's engineering firm. It was part of the conditions of the financing." She understood in that moment what she had signed 3 months ago on page 12 of the bond agreement, in a clause that specified the approved engineering methodology for site drainage. She had read it. She had not understood what she was reading. She had trusted the technical summary and initialed where she was told. She ended the call. She sat with the laptop on her knees for a long time. On the screen, the satellite image of Coldwater Lake was still open in the other tab. The western light across the water, the dark green fringe of old spruce along the shore, the unmarked place where Lenore Marsh had stood in chest waders, counting things that needed counting. In the morning, someone crossed the property line. Declan was up before 5. He'd been up before 5 since February 2022, since the particular morning he'd gotten a phone call on a road outside of Terrace. He made coffee and sat on the porch and watched the sky go from black to charcoal to a pale gray that was almost green behind the spruce line. At 6:40, he saw the truck, white pickup, unfamiliar, moving slowly along the south fence. He set his coffee down. He walked out across the field, quiet, no hurry. He was 40 meters from the truck when it stopped and a man got out with a survey rod. "Son," Declan said. "You're on marshland." The surveyor called someone. Declan called the RCMP detachment. The constable, a woman he'd known since she'd moved to Harrow Creek 3 years ago, arrived in 11 minutes. She stepped out of the cruiser and walked to Declan first. "Morning, Mr. Marsh. What are we looking at?" The surveyor's truck was off marshland in under 20 minutes. Simone arrived as they were leaving. She came on foot from where she'd parked on the main road, and she was not in the tailored coat. She was in jeans and a rain jacket that she'd bought at the Canadian Tire in Smithers the day before, still stiff at the seams. She stopped at the fence line. "I didn't send them," she said. Declan looked at her for a long moment. The constable looked between them, then back at Declan. "I know," he said. The constable got back in her cruiser and left. Simone stood on the other side of the fence. From the porch, Bryn was watching. She lifted her hand in a small wave. After a beat, Simone lifted hers back. That evening, Simone sat in her motel room with the bond agreement open to page 12 and a yellow legal pad beside her. She wrote 3 columns: what I signed, what I understood I was signing, what I know now. The columns were not equal. Her phone rang. The lead partner of the bond syndicate, a man based in Calgary whose name appeared on 6 different corporate registrations, she'd looked up that afternoon. She let it ring. She let it go to voicemail. Then she typed Declan Marsh's name into the provincial corporate registry, the same database she'd used 2 days ago, and she kept reading. Marsh Family Holdings, 1923, commercial timber license, senior water license, a priority date of 1931, which meant it predated virtually every other water license in the watershed, a property tax assessment she had to look at twice, $2,900,000, base value, total acreage, 462, and below that, a notation she'd missed before, an easement registered to the property in 2019 in Lenore Marsh's name, donating 40 meters of riparian buffer along the entire creek frontage to the provincial crown in perpetuity for ecological preservation, registered 6 months before she died. Simone read that line 3 times, then she closed the laptop and lay back on the bedspread, fully dressed, and looked at the ceiling for a while. She did not check her phone. She did not open the laptop again. She was thinking about a woman she had never met who had spent a winter afternoon in a lawyer's office donating 4 meters of creek bank to a province that hadn't asked for it, because she believed the creek needed protecting by someone, whether she was there to do it or not. She drove back out to Harrow Creek at 10:30. She had not called ahead. She didn't pack a bag. The light was on in the kitchen. She could see it from the gate. She parked and walked up the gravel in the dark. Declan came out onto the porch before she knocked. He said, "It's late, I know." She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "I'm not here as a developer." He looked at her for a long second. Then he pushed the screen door open and held it. She stepped up onto the porch. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She looked at it, the Calgary number again. She put it face down in her jacket pocket. They sat in 2 wooden chairs at the end of the porch with cups of tea until the sky started to go gray. He told her about the summer Lenore mapped the lower watershed, the year Bryn was born. How he'd followed her through the sedge meadows, carrying the sampling kit because she needed both hands for the clipboard. He told her about the blue binders on the shelf in the loft and how he hadn't moved them. She told him about her father, about growing up in the tower, about learning to read a balance sheet before she learned to read a tide chart, which meant she'd always known the price of waterfront and never known what water was actually for. At some point, she said, she would have won the heritage designation, wouldn't she? If she'd lived? Yes, he said. Then I want to finish it for her, she said. Not for the deal, because it's right. He looked at the dark tree line and didn't answer for a while. I know you don't have a reason to believe that, she said. Not yet, he said. It wasn't a no. The next morning, they drove together to Smithers. Bryn was with the O'Callagh family in Harrow Creek. where Bet had promised pancakes and a slow morning. Simone sat in the passenger seat of the mud-flecked F2 or 50, with the yellow legal pad on her lap. Somewhere north of Morristown, she began to talk about what she'd found in the bond agreement. He drove and listened. She had spent the previous night going through every page of the financing documents she'd signed over the preceding 6 months. What she'd found, at the end of it, was not incompetence on her part. It was deliberate. The syndicate's engineering firm had buried the diversion specification inside the methodology appendix. Her infrastructure director, now, she understood, a man who had been placed on her team by the syndicate, not hired through her own process, had summarized the drainage plan in language that concealed what it would do. She had signed it in good faith. That was not the same as not being responsible. She understood the difference. "What do you need?" Declan said, "to undo it." "A cooperating witness who can testify to the misrepresentation," she said, "and documentation of the syndicate's prior conduct in other deals." She paused. "I know someone who might have both." She made a call. A woman named Hazel Drummond, a former compliance officer at the bond syndicate who had been managing a quiet legal claim against them for 14 months. Hazel picked up on the third ring. They met her at a coffee shop on Main Street in Smithers, a narrow room with exposed brick and a handwritten menu on a chalkboard. Hazel was small and deliberate, with the particular calm of someone who has been right about something for a long time and has learned to wait. She set a USB drive on the table between them. 14 months of emails, she said. 3 projects. Same playbook. She looked at Simone. "I've been waiting for someone from inside a deal to corroborate the pattern." Simone looked at Declan. Declan looked at Simone. "Tell me what you need from me," she said to Hazel. The filings went to the BC Securities Commission and the Provincial Environmental Assessment Office on a Tuesday morning. Hazel's lawyer filed first, with Simone's sworn affidavit as corroboration, and a package of internal syndicate communications proving the diversion specification had been placed, deliberately, in 4 separate development proposals, including Coldwater Lake. By noon, the syndicate's lead partner had been contacted by securities investigators. By 3, the Harlow Group board received formal notice that the bond financing for the Coldwater Lake project was suspended pending investigation. By 5, 2 other developers in BC, who had experienced the same buried engineering clause, came forward. Declan and Simone were in the parking lot of the government office in Smithers when the last confirmation came through on her phone. They did not do anything dramatic. They stood beside the truck in the November cold, and Simone read the email twice, and then she looked up at the Babine Range visible above the rooftops, white at the tops now, the kind of blue cold sky that only comes in the north in autumn. "What happens to the project?" he said. "It's over in its current form. The financing is gone." She pocketed the phone. "I could restructure. A smaller scale, no marina, no shoreline infrastructure, heritage designation protected as a feature rather than an obstacle. It would take 2 years and a completely different investor." She looked at him. "Or I could do something I haven't done yet." He looked at her sideways. He didn't ask. 2 weeks later, Simone drove back up the highway to Harrow Creek in a Subaru she'd rented in Prince George. The Escalade had gone back to Vancouver with the rest of the Harlow Group's advance team. She stayed in the room above the Millstone Cafe that Bet rented out in the off-season. A small room with a slanted ceiling and a view of the main street and a quilt on the bed that had been made by Bet's mother. She wore the jeans from Canadian Tire. She bought work gloves at the feed store on the south end of town. By the second week, they had the particular worn softness of gloves that have been used. She had coffee on the porch of the main house every morning with Declan and Bryn. Bryn had decided to teach her to identify bird calls. This involved sitting on the porch steps in the early cold and listening, and Simone being wrong more often than not, and Bryn being patient about it in the way that children are patient when they know something the adult doesn't. On a Thursday morning, Bryn said, "That one." Simone listened. "Chickadee? No, that's a varied thrush. They sound like someone tuning a radio." She demonstrated with her mouth, a pure descending note. "Listen." From the kitchen window, Declan watched with his coffee. The formal announcement came on the second Monday. Simone had spent the previous week on calls with 3 conservation organizations, a provincial heritage trust, and a land economist out of Prince George who had spent his career finding ways to make ecological protection financially sustainable. She announced the dissolution of the Coldwater Lake Resort proposal and the transfer of her personal interest in the project to a conservation land trust. Structured as a partnership between Harlow Group's philanthropic arm, the Marsh family, and the provincial crown. Initial capitalization, her whistleblower award, her personal savings, and the proceeds from the sale of her Cole Harbor apartment. The syndicate's lead partner was charged under the Securities Act. His misrepresentation case was referred to the RCMP Commercial Crime Unit. 3 months of proceedings followed that Hazel Drummond navigated with the confidence of someone who has been building toward a single correct moment for over a year. Hollis Vance, no. Here in Harrow Creek it was a man named Gordon Beale, who had run the feed and hardware store for 38 years, and who had watched the syndicate come through twice before. Sat in the hearing room in his good jacket and answered questions in plain sentences. When it was done, he shook Declan's hand in the hallway. He did not say much. He was the kind of man who understood that some things that needed saying had already been said. Declan's lawyer called on a Friday afternoon, late. The heritage designation for the Coldwater Creek watershed had been approved by the provincial minister. Lenore's application filed posthumously by the estate, completed by a conservation biologist. Declan had hired the previous spring to carry the work forward, approved in full. Coldwater Creek would be protected. The lower riparian zone, the sedge meadows, the amphibian breeding habitat Lenore had mapped from a clipboard in the rain, all of it designated as a provincially significant ecological area. Declan was in the loft when the call came. He sat down at the desk afterward and did not move for a while. He looked at the blue binders on the shelf, the block-printed base, the block-printed labels, the map drawer that pulled out beneath them. He reached over and put his hand flat on the nearest binder. He was still sitting there when Bryn came up the stairs and found him. She looked at his face. She climbed onto the stool beside the desk without saying anything, and she sat there with him, and the loft was quiet except for the wind in the spruce outside. After a while she said, "Is it good news?" "Yeah," he said. "It's good news." She put her head on his shoulder. He did not move. Simone came for supper on Wednesdays. That was how it started, and that was what it remained for a while. A third place set at the table, a habit that became a thing nobody remarked on. She was renting the house on the north end of Cedar, Harrow Creek's Main Street, the one with the green door and the wood stove that took 20 minutes to get going in the morning. She liked the mornings. She had not liked mornings in Vancouver. She formally resigned from Harlow Group's executive board and declined the offer to lead the restructured company. In its place, she registered a new organization under provincial law, a conservation development consultancy, structured to help family landowners navigate exactly the kind of financing pressure that had come for Declan's property. First funding came from a mix of her own assets and 2 philanthropic foundations that had been looking for this kind of model for years. She was not sure what she was building yet. That was all right. She had time. One afternoon in December, she drove out to the property to return a book she'd borrowed from the shelf in the kitchen, a field guide to interior BC birds, marked throughout in a hand that wasn't Declan's. She found him at the south fence with a spool of new wire and a post driver, working the tree line where the old fence had rusted through. She parked. She walked down to him through the dry grass. The sky was the high white blue of a BC December, the mountains showing clean above the valley. The spruce were dark. The creek showed between them in the low places, running clear. She held the wire taut while he drove the posts. They worked without talking for most of an hour. She was not good at it yet, but she was learning what the wire wanted. When the last post was set, they stood together looking south, across the pasture, toward the tree line where Coldwater Creek ran past the old-growth fringe and into the lake. She said, "I keep thinking about the line in her application, about the creek existing independent of any title claim made upon it." He looked at the water through the trees. "She meant that the creek doesn't belong to anyone," he said. "Just because someone writes their name on a piece of paper doesn't mean the creek knows about it." Simone thought about Cole Harbor, about the tower, about the way her father had taught her to read a waterfront and never taught her to hear one. "I'm starting to understand that," she said. The sound of small boots came through the dry grass behind them. Bryn came around the end of the fence, in her tow cup, and her orange vest, carrying 2 paper cups of hot chocolate from the thermos she'd made herself because she'd decided that a thermos was important for winter. She handed one to each of them without ceremony, like it was simply a thing that needed doing. She stood between them and looked out at the creek through the trees. Simone wrapped both hands around the cup. The warmth came through the paper. Declan looked at his daughter. He looked at the creek. He looked for a brief moment at the woman standing beside his daughter in work gloves that were starting to learn the shape of her hands. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The creek was still running. It would run past this fence and these three people and past whatever came after them. The way it had run past every name written in every deed since 1923. The way it had run before any of those names existed, cold and clear and certain, through the country it had always been. He reached over and took the empty cup from Bryn when she was done. He put an arm around her shoulders. On Bryn's other sides, Simone did not move away. Some things don't need to be named to be real.